I, the betrayed wife. My name is Emily Carter, and for most of my 35 years, I believed I knew exactly who I was. A devoted wife, a loving mother, and a dependable friend. I grew up in a sleepy Oregon town, not far from Portland, the sort of place where neighbors wave hello, and weekends mean homemade pie and potluck picnics in the park. By the time I married Paul Carter at 23, most of my childhood dreams had faded, replaced by what seemed like the real promise of stability and ordinary happiness. We bought our cedar-sided house on a quiet street in Maplewood, the same year my oldest Jordan started kindergarten. Sunlight would filter through the kitchen in the morning while I packed lunches, and for years, it felt like we were living out the American dream, only a little quieter than advertised. Before everything changed, I was the kind of woman who remembered birthdays, who sugar-dusted cupcakes for school fundraisers, who could laugh off the small annoyances of married life. Dirty socks on the floor, an occasional late meeting, the way Paul sometimes forgot even his own coffee order. Our life together was not perfect, but it was ours. Maplewood is a close-knit suburb where secrets rarely last. People know which mailbox belongs to which family, and little kids with sticky fingers play baseball all summer beneath the maple trees. I had my routines, my book club, a circle of friends, none closer than Amanda Williams, who lived 2 streets over and, for more than a decade, was the sister I never had. I realize now there were cracks in the glass I didn't want to see. Nights when Paul's laughter sounded a bit forced at dinner, subtle glances between Amanda and him that I wrote off as friendly. But at the time, my days slipped by in the gentle rhythms of suburban life. I grocery shopped at the corner market. I clipped roses for the vase on our dining table. I believed in my marriage and the small world we'd built together. Looking back, I wonder if I was naive or simply hopeful. Sometimes I think about the way trust works, how you can spend years, even decades, building it stone by stone, only for it to crumble in a heartbeat. The foundation of our family felt so strong to me, so certain. I took pride in the roles I played: wife, mother, neighbor, friend. And beneath it all, I saw myself as resilient, the kind of woman who could weather any storm, who would hold her family together no matter what. Ironically, my devotion became something else entirely, something I hardly recognized in myself once the truth came out. But in those early mornings, before the kids woke up, before the sun pressed gold squares across the kitchen floor, I was still just Emily Carter, list maker, meal planner, lover of library book sales and sunflowers. I was the wife who built her world on trust, hoping it would always be enough. If only I had known then how quickly that world could change, and how much strength I'd need to find the woman hiding beneath the surface when the life I thought I knew slipped away. The day I discovered the truth, it was a Tuesday, just another ordinary Tuesday, or so I believed, when the illusion of my safe, familiar life shattered. The morning had started like any other. Fumes of coffee swirling in the kitchen, cereal bowls clinking, the kids squabbling over the last cinnamon roll on the counter. Paul kissed me goodbye on his way out, his smile absent-minded, already halfway out the door in his pressed shirt and tie. If I noticed anything off, I told myself it was just the stress of work. I'd grown used to those long silences, the harried phone calls about deadlines. That afternoon, after finishing up my freelance work, I decided to tackle the overwhelming clutter in the office. I wasn't looking for anything in particular. Old receipts, maybe, or the library book that had been overdue for a week. I settled into sorting paperwork at Paul's desk, and that's when my hand brushed over his tablet. He didn't usually leave it out. It was almost always zipped into his messenger bag, or charging in the locked drawer. I remember pausing, feeling a faint stir of unease. Curiosity, maybe even a flicker of suspicion, made me wake the screen. Paul's password was our wedding anniversary. The same 6 digits he'd used for years. It felt strangely intimate. Putting it in, almost like opening a door I knew I shouldn't. What I found waiting for me changed everything. The first thing that flashed across the screen was a string of messages from Amanda. I hesitated, hands trembling, breath caught behind my ribs. Amanda and I texted almost every day, sharing photos of our kids or swapping recipes. But this was different. A stream of late-night private messages I hadn't seen, filled with familiar inside jokes and endearments that felt too intimate, too rehearsed. I heard my heart thudding in my ears and scrolled further. One image, sent at midnight, finally pierced the last veil. It was a photo of the two of them, unmistakably close, faces lit by candlelight in a restaurant I didn't recognize. The words beneath it were a whisper in the dark. Last night with you was perfect. I wish it never had to end. Over and over, more messages. Confessions, declarations, plans that didn't include me. For a moment, I thought I might faint. My vision blurred, and I pressed both hands to my face, as if I could physically block out the reality unfolding in front of me. Betrayal is a strange thing. It comes all at once, but it's also a slow unraveling. I sat there for what felt like hours, reading every word, desperate for some explanation or mistake, a reason that didn't involve the absolute worst. As the sun dipped low behind my kitchen window, shading the room in amber and blue, something fundamental inside me broke. All the years of trust, the certainty of who I was, who we were, snapped like a brittle branch. I didn't cry, not yet. Instead, a cold calm settled in as I closed the tablet and placed it back on the desk, careful, almost loving, as though touching it any other way would make what I'd seen more real. That was the day my marriage ended, although neither of us said so out loud. By the time Paul walked back through the door that evening, I already saw him, and Amanda, and maybe even myself, with new, unblinking eyes. The world as I had known it was gone. All that was left was the unsteady ground beneath my feet, and 1,000 silent questions that would haunt me long after the house fell quiet. Rising from despair. When people talk about heartbreak, they rarely mention the heavy, practical silence that settles after. After the discovery, that silence pressed down on me like a weighted blanket I couldn't shed, clinging, suffocating, relentless. In the movies, betrayal erupts in rage or tears. For me, it came as numbness, the edges of life muffled and blurred. I drifted through the next several days, as if someone else was living in my skin, a sleepwalker shuffling through familiar routines, in a house that suddenly felt alien. Every room seemed to echo with ghosts, laughter that wasn't mine, conversations I couldn't trust, paused memories. I learned that grief wasn't a tidal wave, but a slow seep, worming behind the walls until suddenly everything sags and buckles. The mornings were the worst. I'd wake up and for one blissful, confused moment, believe it was all a bad dream, and then my chest would tighten with the realization. No, everything really had changed, and I had no idea who to be now. Paul seemed to sense a shift. Though I became expert at blending my wounds with the quiet, he'd ask, "Are you okay?" In that careful way people do when they don't really want the answer. I lied. I became practiced in the art of lying. "I'm fine. Just tired. No, nothing's wrong. Yes, of course I still want to meet Amanda for coffee." My acting wasn't for him anymore, nor Amanda. It was for my children, for my neighbors, for the fractured idea of myself that I was desperate to salvage. I let the routines hold me because I was afraid of what would happen if I let go. School drop-offs, grocery lists, laundry dropped into the machine in the steady, predictable hum that reminded me life could go on. At least, for everyone else. Jordan's soccer practice, Abby's spelling test. I clung to these small tasks. They were proof I was still needed, that some part of everyday life was salvageable. It took days, maybe weeks, before the numbness began to thaw, and when it did, it hurt worse than the silence. My anger felt too big to squeeze inside my ribs. I started snapping at the kids for leaving crumbs on the counter, at Paul for breathing too loudly, at the cat for existing. I hated myself for it. But the truth is, anger was a relief. It made me feel alive, even if it was ugly. One morning, a month after the discovery, I found myself sitting on the cold tile floor of the pantry, half hidden by cereal boxes and juice pouches, just breathing and shaking. It struck me then, maybe for the first time since my life splintered, that I was the only one who could choose where I went from here. Paul and Amanda had both made their choices. Now it was my turn. But I didn't know how. I had no blueprint for surviving this kind of betrayal. No wise mother or therapist whispering scripts in my ear. So, I started small. I made a list across the back of an old grocery receipt. Things I could control. Feed the kids breakfast, answer one work email, take a 10-minute walk. That day, I did all three. Not well, not gracefully, but I did them. I discovered the strange power of tiny victories. Putting on real clothes instead of pajamas, pretending coffee might make a dent in the misery, texting my mom just to tell her I loved her without explaining why. It wasn't healing, not yet, but it was survival. And survival slowly, irrevocably, becomes something more. In the quiet late-night hours, after the kids went to bed, my mind spun circles, replaying memories, constructing arguments I'd never have the guts to say out loud, imagining ways to win back my old life, or at least the self-respect I'd lost. But another part of me, the part that stubbornly refuses to break, began to take notes. I started paying attention, not just to Paul's lies, but to my own resilience. Every time I got out of bed when I wanted to hide, every kindness I gave my children when my heart felt carved open, every small act that said, "You are still here, you matter." I became a collector of details. Subtle changes in Paul's behavior. The way Amanda smiled a little too brightly at neighborhood barbecues, the late-night credit card charges, the pale pink scarf in the back seat that didn't belong to our family. Each fact gathered wasn't just about retribution. It was about piecing together reality. If I could understand the shape of my life, maybe I could find new edges for who I might become. But rising from despair wasn't simple or linear. There were days I regressed, curled up under a blanket, letting dishes pile up in the sink, watching episodes of some sitcom for hours, just to keep my mind anywhere but the present. I learned to forgive myself for the failures, to treat every day as a blank page, not a test. I reached out, tentatively, to people I distanced myself from. My college friend Lindsay, who called me out of the blue, became my late-night confidant. I began attending a local yoga class, not for fitness, but because for 45 minutes, I could surrender to someone else's instructions, someone else's pace. It turns out, sorrow can breed an odd kind of courage. I stopped pretending for the sake of appearances. Sometimes, I even told the truth. Things are hard right now, but I'm still here. None of this makes a pretty story. There was no single day I woke up healed, no movie moment epiphany. There were tears on the steering wheel, cold pizza for dinner more nights than I care to admit, and weeks where every sunrise felt like proof that nothing gets easier just because you want it to. Yet the cracks that once threatened to break me became unlikely windows. I began to see the world differently. Friendships I'd taken for granted, laughter I'd missed, the beauty in ordinary afternoons with my kids. I learned that it's possible to build something new out of ruins, even if it's slow and clumsy and painful. Rising from despair didn't mean I stopped hurting, or that I forgave, or even forgot. It simply meant that I stood up, first shakily, then stronger, for myself. And with every forward step, I laid the first stones of a future that belonged to me, however uncertain that future might be. And just like that, without even noticing the precise moment it happened, I began to believe in possibility again. Not the old kind, naive, sweet, and whole, but a weathered, hard-won hope that said, "You are more than what's been done to you. Your story is not finished, not yet." My revenge plan. Grief, at some point, transforms. For weeks, my sadness was like a low tide, dragging everything out to a lonely, muddy shore. Then, without warning, it turned. Hurt fermented. Numbness cracked, and all the dormant rage and humiliation surfaced like a storm. I wanted justice, not the kind any court could give me, but a balancing of scales in my own shattered life. That's when the plan, no, the need, for revenge took root. Let me be clear. I wasn't born vengeful. I believed in kindness, in grace. But betrayal rewires something basic inside you. I was tired of being the woman things simply happened to. I wanted to become the woman who made things happen, who pushed back, who held people accountable. Revenge, for me, began as a spark in the emptiness, a whisper that said, "Take back some power." Cataloging the sins. Before I acted, I spent long, sleepless nights cataloging every detail, painstakingly, methodically, as if preparing for an examination I couldn't afford to fail. I started with the obvious, the evidence I'd uncovered on Paul's tablet, those late-night messages, the photos, pet names, secrets hidden in plain sight. I copied it all, backing up everything twice, an insurance policy for the coming storm. But anger sharpened my recall. I began to remember oddities, receipts for hotel rooms during business trips, Amanda's perfume lingering on Paul's jacket, endless, implausible excuses for missed family events. I combed through finances, endless lines on credit card statements, withdrawals explained away but never quite accounted for, Venmo payments, gifts, dinners, tiny betrayals accumulating, each a splinter under the skin of our marriage. Retrospect distilled all these slights and omissions into cold ammunition. My plan would not be messy or impulsive. I wanted precision. I wanted each move to count. Amanda, the fall of Maplewood's perfect mom. Amanda Williams was not just my best friend. She was Maplewood's living, breathing role model. Photogenic, witty, always willing to bring gluten-free cookies to the PTA. Her Instagram, a highlight reel of flower crowns, perfect lattes, and hand-lettered inspirational quotes. She smiled at everyone, remembered birthdays, chaired charity auctions, and hosted wine nights. For years, I worshipped her from the inside, her confidant, her ride or die. Now it sickened me to see how well she wore her mask. My first target, Amanda's reputation. It wasn't enough for her to know I knew. I needed the curtain pulled down for everyone. So I started quietly. Maplewood ran on whispers before it ran on facts. I sent an anonymous tip to our HOA president about Amanda's questionable spending at last year's charity fundraiser, her missing receipts for designer clothing bought during the event. I forwarded screenshots of her private, snarky texts about other moms to the very group chats she'd gossiped about. Then, the coup de grace. A single, carefully worded email to the board of directors at the elementary school, attaching messages where Amanda had ridiculed the children of board members. Not forged, not exaggerated, just the ugly truth in her own words. I watched, heart-thudding, as the dominoes fell. One by one, her committees removed her. Invitations dried up. The sympathetic posts appeared. Then the necessary public scramble from Amanda to explain what couldn't be explained. She called, texted, showed up at my door crying. I was unmoved. I stared at her. This woman I'd trusted. This woman who'd carved me out of my own life, and felt nothing but the cold, fierce justice of a wrong righted. See, Paul, the crumbling pillar. Paul Carter liked to believe he was the rock, the straightforward family man, the steady hand in our chaos, beloved by his underlings at work. His career at Heliotech defined him. His pride rested on being the dependable, hard-nosed project manager in a cutthroat industry. But what his colleagues didn't know, with all their team-building exercises and performance bonuses, was that he couldn't keep his own promises at home. I decided that if honesty made me a fool, it could make Paul vulnerable too. I started with small leaks, anonymous emails to Heliotech's HR department, CC'd to just the right VP, documenting the time-stamped evidence of his inappropriate office relationship. I attached proof of his frequent sick days that matched those late-night hotel receipts. I even included documentation of projects he took credit for, but left others to complete. I included only facts, no embellishments. The truth was damning enough. The hardest part was showing no reaction when, 2 weeks later, he was called into a surprise review. I folded laundry while he sat in stunned silence, blinking at his phone. There was an internal investigation. He was suspended, pending review. His emails stopped. The new project was reassigned. Paul, the infallible, shrank inwards, edges fraying. It would have been easier to gloat, but all I felt was exhaustion. I didn't want to destroy him. I just wanted him to feel, at least for a moment, what he'd made me feel. Powerless, uncertain, afraid. The chess game. Calculating every move. Revenge is never just about two people. It's a web, spinning out into the lives of everyone who floats into its orbit. School drop-off lines became icy. Playdates were canceled without explanation. Amanda's husband, Mark, cornered Paul at the gym. The fallout spread, as all secrets eventually must. What started as a personal vendetta drew the tight little world of Maplewood into our private hurricane. I documented everything meticulously, just as I had when organizing the PTA's Spring Festival. Spreadsheets, folders, screen captures, even summaries of the ways their betrayals intersected with mine. This wasn't just vengeance. It was putting my finger on the pulse of our little universe and forcing it to acknowledge what I'd endured, what breaking trust really cost. Yet, as every headline in our town's whisper mill seemed to mention Paul or Amanda, and hollowness settled over me. Revenge had power. It was also addictive. I found myself refreshing Facebook, reading group chats, longing for updates. Each small victory blunted the pain, but only for an hour or two. I began to wonder what it meant if the only way out of my sorrow was through someone else's shame. The unexpected cost. At first, watching Amanda unravel and Paul stumble brought a guilty satisfaction. I was finally visible, not as a martyr, but as a woman wronged and justified. But as days slipped by, consequences echoed beyond their intended targets. Mark and Amanda's children were shunned at school. Paul, retreated into himself, moving about the house like a ghost. Our own kids, Jordan and Abby, grew quieter, watching cartoons alone, glancing up when either parent entered the room. They didn't know the truth, but they felt it. No amount of forced cheerfulness could plaster my cracks invisible. Sometimes, after a text from a gloating neighbor or an awkward PTA run-in, I'd lie in bed and question it all. Was I protecting myself or poisoning the well water for everyone? Had my pain mutated into something I'd regret? I remembered being a girl, promising myself I'd never become bitter like my aunt, who nursed grudges the way other women nursed tea. Here I was, drowning out grief by growing a garden of resentments that bore only sour fruit. F. The tipping point. Reflection amidst ruins. It came to a head one rainy Sunday when Jordan asked, quietly, if we weren't going over to Amanda's anymore, and why Daddy was always home now. I couldn't answer without lying or oversharing. Staring at my son's worried eyes, the sense of righteousness in my chest twisted into something shameful. That night, pacing in the kitchen, long after the house was quiet, I acknowledged a truth I'd been avoiding. Revenge had changed everyone. I'd tipped the scales, but the universe rushed to fill the void not with justice, but with pain spilling in all directions. If vengeance was supposed to heal me, why did I feel emptier than ever? If I fixed everything so they'd know how it feels, what did it say about who I'd become? G. The meaning. Underneath, owning my choices. Despite my regrets, despite the guilt and fallout, I didn't excuse their actions or pretend my pain wasn't real. Betrayal deserved a reckoning. Some truths needed to see daylight, no matter how ugly the aftermath. But as I moved through each day, I also realized that healing was not the same as payback. Power over others is fleeting. It comes with the kind of aftermath you have to sweep up alone. The only person I could really control was myself. All the plans, the calculations, the cold executions, they were attempts to wring respect and dignity out of a universe that had briefly gone off its rails. Letting go of them, of the need to punish, even of my own illusions, became the hardest, most necessary part of my story. My revenge plan exacted its price from all of us. Yet in burning so much down, I discovered a crucial scrap of self-respect. I could fight for myself, draw boundaries, and survive the storm. What came next would have to be about building, not destroying, because power released into pain is just more pain scattered. But power reclaimed, gently, thoughtfully, could become something else. The courage to start over, for real this time. The secrets below the surface. I once thought of secrets as sealed boxes, tucked high in a closet, hidden behind coats, forgotten until someone deliberately pried them open. Now I know better. Secrets are water, weaving into drywall, in foundations, shaping the rooms you live in long before you ever spot the rot. My pursuit of vengeance against Paul and Amanda did not end the day their worlds cracked open. In fact, with each domino that tipped, new shadows lengthened across my life. Shadows I had never thought to question. After the dust of my schemes began to settle, I noticed the peculiar quiet. Maplewood, so alive with gossip and speculation, had turned its gaze on me with the same intensity it once reserved for Amanda's meticulously curated photos. I felt bare, exposed, not just to the judgment of neighbors, but to truths in my own home I could no longer unsee. It began innocuously enough. One mid-morning, weeks after Paul's suspension and Amanda's social exile, I was sifting old paperwork for clues of Paul's duplicity. My plan, always so sharp in the beginning, had left behind a trove of receipts Emails, calendar alerts, business cards in anonymous hotel lobbies. I thought I'd collected it all, but in the bottom of a fireproof box, I found a folder I'd never noticed. Life insurance statements, tax documents going back a decade, files labeled with my maiden name. It sounds strange, maybe, but I'd always let Paul handle the finances, another quiet concession, built from years of trusting him to be steady, where I felt scattered. With a curious, slightly bitter resolve, I made coffee and sat down to audit the marriage I'd lost, unraveling the finances. It started with numbers that didn't make sense. That led to more questions than answers. There were credit card charges to stores I'd never shopped, expensive dinners in downtown Portland on nights Paul told me he worked late, recurring monthly payments to accounts I couldn't trace. I found evidence of a vacation I'd never taken, a hotel reservation for two in Seattle, charged to our joint card the same weekend I'd been visiting my mother with the kids. On a scratched-up flash drive left in Paul's desk was a spreadsheet tracking large cash withdrawals. The file was named consulting, but the dollar amounts were out of scale for the contracts he'd ever mentioned. It occurred to me, with a sick clarity, that the betrayal hadn't begun or ended with Amanda. The affair was only the visible symptom. There'd been other women, perhaps, or other secrets I would never entirely nail down. More than that, I realized Paul had been siphoning trust and money from our life for much longer than I'd ever dared imagine, and I had colluded with my own ignorance. My anger, once sharp and righteous, dulled into something quieter now. I was furious, yes, but also newly ashamed. For my blindness, for what I'd enabled in the name of marital peace. The children, their own secrets. In the haze of all that upheaval, I had missed warning signs in my children, too. Jordan, 12 years old and already awkward with adolescence, began coming home late, but evasive about his day. I'd assumed it was schoolwork, friends, the usual growing pains. But a call from his math teacher revealed a different narrative. Missed homework, a fight in the cafeteria, declining grades. One afternoon, I found a crumpled note beneath his bed. The handwriting was shaky. "Are you mad at me? Did I do something wrong?" Later, it dawned on me that the silence at home, thick with all the tension I'd tried to bury, had weighed on the kids in ways I hadn't seen. Abby, only 8, grew quieter as well, her once breezy chatter replaced by solemn questions at the breakfast table. "Mom, did I get in trouble? Why is Daddy so sad?" She started sleeping in my bed again, clutching her old blanket, listening for reassurance I was often too distracted to give. Even the cat became withdrawn, disappearing for hours at a time. I started to wonder, was there any part of this household untouched by secrecy and the slow erosion of trust? My social circle, the friends I never really knew after Amanda's outing, in the resulting drama, most of my so-called friends retreated. Only a handful reached out, and their motives were, at times, suspect. More than one neighbor stopped by with concern, but their questions always harshly skirted the boundaries I wasn't ready to tear down further. One afternoon, Linda Carmichael, president of the HOA and Amanda's old rival, brought me a casserole. She was kind, solicitous, and listened as I vented about the mess my life had become. Then, within a week, a distortion of my side of the story was making its rounds in a local Facebook group, my words twisted and sprinkled with judgment. I realized I, too, had underestimated the ripple effects of gossip, that friendships in Maplewood were often transactional, kept alive as long as you didn't threaten anyone's idea of what a good life should look like. But there were exceptions. Lindsay, my college roommate who had drifted out of orbit when my world became all about Paul and the kids, turned out to be a lifeline. Her honesty, gentle check-ins, and absolute lack of interest in neighborhood politics gave me breathing space I desperately needed. Digging into my own past, sifting through Paul's and Amanda's old messages, I stumbled across emails from years ago, snapshots of our college selves, glimpses of Emily before motherhood. I had forgotten the sharpness of my youthful ambitions, the poems I'd written, the travel plans I used to daydream about. Somewhere in the last decade, I had traded so much of myself away, sometimes in the name of sacrifice, mostly in the name of comfort. Now those losses stung in new ways. I wondered if there were invisible secrets I'd kept from myself, dreams I had willfully let die. As much as I wanted to rename Paul the villain of my story, I saw that my own complacency had contributed to my heartbreak. Paul's deception was not my fault, but my willingness to silence doubts, to keep the peace, to ignore that cold flicker of suspicion on nights he came home late. All of that belonged to me. The complexity of Paul, more than a villain. Each layer, I peeled back on Paul's secretive life, revealed more ambiguity than I ever could have expected. I discovered an unsent email to his father, written late one night after a drunken argument, in which he confessed to doubts, insecurities, and a sense of being lost in his own marriage. There were web searches for marriage counseling, drafts of apology letters, evidence that for a time, a short, insufficient time, he had wanted to fix things, or at least to stop himself from destroying what we had. These glimpses didn't excuse his actions, but they did drain some of the black and white rage from my narrative. He was, I had to admit, a broken man as much as a betrayer. And I, in my vengeful haze, had not always been the attentive wife I told myself I was. Amanda, layers of her own. As Maplewood turned its back on Amanda, little by little her mask slipped before me, too. There was bitterness in her emails to mutual friends. Yes, but also confessions of loneliness, feeling like a perennial outsider, envy of my perfect life, envy that, in the end, had shattered us both. At the bottom of all her conniving, I found the outline of an insecure woman who had spent her energy imitating happiness rather than ever truly tasting it. She stopped by our house once, weeks after it all came out, her eyes puffy, desperation radiating from every inch of her frame. We did not hug. We couldn't manage small talk. She said, "I never wanted to hurt you. I just didn't know how not to." That was the closest thing to an apology she could muster. And as much as I hated her in that moment, I also pitied her. The secrets in the community, the more I eavesdropped on conversations at school pickup, the more I noticed other families carrying wounds invisible to the casual observer. A marriage in trouble, undisclosed layoffs, rumors about another mother's drinking. Maplewood was never the utopia I'd painted in my mind. Paul and Amanda's affair was only a catalyst, exposing cracks that already crisscrossed beneath many front doors. That understanding bred, if not forgiveness, then at least humility. I was no longer a martyr, singular in my pain. I was one wounded person, among many, navigating a landscape where no one's joys or wounds were quite as simple as they first appeared. A new, uncomfortable honesty. The greatest secret I unearthed, though, wasn't in Paul's missing receipts, Amanda's private texts, or my children's anxieties. It was in myself. If being betrayed felt like a death, then exposing these deeper truths was the work of carving a new life from the rubble. I was forced to admit where I had worn masks, where my needs had withered unspoken, where I had failed to see my family's distress amid my own self-absorption. In the aftermath, I started talking to a therapist, Not for answers, but for a place to say these uncomfortable facts aloud. I told my mother more of the truth, admitted to Lindsay that I was lonelier than I'd ever let on. I apologized to Jordan and Abby for missing their signals and began, however awkwardly, to make space for their questions and fears. Building a life on what's true trust, I've learned, is built on seeing all the way down, even into the muddy places you'd rather not acknowledge. My old life, not just my marriage, but my image of myself, came apart by degrees, but as the secret surfaced, I felt a strange sense of relief. There could be no more pretending, no more silent bargains with reality. Each day, I chose truth, even if it was ugly, over the shallow comfort of denial. I faced the family I had, imperfect, wounded, and still worthy of love, rather than the fantasy I once curated for the benefit of others. I know now that secrets never quite die. They transform, shimmer beneath the surface, shape us in ways small and large. But if you're brave enough to look, to truly look, you begin, at last, to live honestly. You learn to build something solid, not by hiding the mess, but by making meaning from it. And that, I think, is the real gift in tearing down the old walls. Seeing, for the first time, what was always there, the moment I faced myself. For a long stretch after everything, after betrayal, and even after the storm of revenge, I thought the worst was behind me. I clung to that idea with the same intensity I once clung to my routines, my marriage, the myth of Maplewood's perfect family. But pain is strange. It doesn't just vanish with time and action. It mutates, finds new places to hide, new ways to infiltrate your boundaries. It lingers, waiting for you to finally stop long enough to notice the quiet devastation within yourself. There are moments in life that rearrange your insides with brutal clarity. No fanfare, no warning. For me, that moment did not arrive with shouts or tears, but in a hush. On an ordinary Tuesday, after the school bus had rumbled away, and the remnants of cold coffee sat abandoned on the counter, my children's laughter was a muffled echo from outside. For the first time in months, the house belonged wholly to me. I moved through it, bathrooms, bedrooms, the battered kitchen table, touching the chipped paint, the stains accumulated over years, as if checking for evidence of my own existence. I ended up in front of the long mirror in my bedroom. It had always been there. A hand-me-down from my mother, a fixture I'd barely noticed beyond cleaning its streaks. Now, I stood and stared. This is a cliché, I know, but the person looking back was both familiar and foreign. Dull-eyed, hair tied in a no-nonsense bun, shoulders hunched with the weight of invisible years. I didn't recognize her. If you'd told me, even a year earlier, that I'd become this version of myself, hollowed, defensive, protector of wounded children and ruined dreams, I might have laughed. But now, in that mirror, I couldn't look away. It was time to confront the reflection. Not just the story I told others, but the truths I kept from myself. Radical honesty. I started with the smallest confessions. Whispering them aloud felt absurd, but there was a power in giving my failures substance. You gave up on your own happiness for stability. You ignored warning signs because you wanted comfort. You let your own needs wither, assuming love meant sacrifice, not partnership. Each line landed heavily. I listed them in my journal, tears spattering the page. For every way Paul and Amanda had betrayed me, there was a smaller, quieter way I had betrayed myself. I had stifled doubts about Paul for the sake of peace. I had told white lies to fill the roles of good wife, supermom, dependable friend, playing parts instead of being authentic. No one demanded these roles of me. I'd inherited them from generations before, internalized them, made them my armor. And then, my anger, not just at Paul and Amanda, but at myself, for looking away, for all the years I let my world shrink until I barely existed outside my titles. The harshest realization was that somewhere along the way, I began to believe invisibility was a virtue. Examining the wounds, it hurt to excavate this pain. Childhood memories, times I felt overlooked, times I learned that being good was safer than being noticed. I saw the echoes in my adult life. The way I downplayed my victories, deferred to stronger personalities, ran from conflict even when it hurt. I remembered the hope, long ago, that marriage would give me more. Purpose, home, belonging. But really, all I wanted was for someone to see me. How strange, then, that in being so terrified of abandonment, I abandoned parts of myself. Confronting that truth made me clutch the edge of the sink and sob, silent and hard, until my body shook. The tears weren't just for the marriage or the lost innocence. They were for every time I silenced myself to make someone else comfortable, for the poetry left in drawers, for dreams I talked myself out of pursuing, for the anger I swallowed and told myself was grace. Letting go of old narratives, recognition, though, brought a strange sense of freedom. In naming my regrets, I could finally put them down. I sat on the bedside rug, breathing deep, and began to write alternative narratives. You don't owe anyone perfection. You are worthy of love. Yours, first. Value does not depend on being chosen, or needed, or useful every second. You're allowed to take up space. You're allowed to claim joy. It felt clumsy and forced at first, as if I were auditioning for a part in a braver woman's story. But repetition, on paper, in the mirror, in silent mantras, carved these words into my consciousness. Each time I noticed shame or self-blame, I paused. When guilt raged over the collateral damage of my actions, I examined it, spoke gently. You did your best. You survived. You made mistakes, and you can do better. This wasn't about excusing everything. I owned my missteps. I thought about the revenge I'd orchestrated, the harm it brought to others, not just my betrayers. I wondered if, beneath righteous anger, I had also wanted to prove I mattered, wanted someone to grieve over my absence the way I grieved theirs. I pledged to be honest, even if the truth was unflattering, even if it meant apologizing to people I'd hurt in my honesty or my rage. Forgiveness, one layer at a time. Forgiving Paul or Amanda seemed impossible, and still does, most days. But that day, I realized the urgency and necessity of forgiving myself. So I tried, awkwardly. I forgive you for ignoring your instincts. I forgive you for not leaving sooner. I forgive you for the coldness you showed your children on bad days, for your moments of bitterness, for the small lies you told to keep surviving. The more I said it, the more another truth emerged. The you I was forgiving was not just the woman in the present, but every former self who operated with limited knowledge and a desperate hope for safety or love. Forgiveness doesn't erase consequences or pain, but it softened the edges of my contempt, made it possible to take a full breath, to stretch in my own skin again, seeking new truths. And in the following days, I ritualized this reckoning. Each morning after the kids left for school, I'd sit with my journal and name whatever truth needed airing. Sometimes it was joyous, a memory of my childhood summers, the thrill of reading a new book, the pride of nailing a freelance deadline. Sometimes it was ugly, envy, insecurity, the certainty that everyone secretly pitied me. Some days the truth was just exhaustion. The more I welcomed these truths, the less frightening they became. I found, strangely, that I was more at ease being with my own pain than pretending everything was fine. I stopped hiding from my children's questions, began responding with simple, honest, age-appropriate truths. I told Jordan one afternoon, when he asked if I was sad, "Yes, sometimes, but sadness isn't forever." Abby, small and sharp-eyed, asked if the family would be okay. I pulled her onto my lap, feeling real love bloom, where once there was only duty. "We're going to be different," I said. "But yes, we'll be okay. I promise." Connections and community reimagined. I reached out to friends I'd neglected, not with perfect scripts, but with honesty. The conversations were sometimes uncomfortable. A few friendships wilted in the wake of my new boundaries. Others survived, stronger for it. I learned to ask for help when I needed it, to receive kindness without suspicion or indebtedness. I attended therapy with greater openness, no longer treating it as a place to fix my feelings, but as a place to understand my patterns and learn healthier ones. My therapist encouraged me to identify not just what I wanted to heal from, but what I wanted to nurture in the life ahead. For the first time, I pictured a future not centered on someone else's needs, but on a vision for myself. Travel, writing, laughter, stillness, rewriting identity. It was tempting, in earlier days, to define myself by victimhood or vengeance. Now, standing on the shifting ground of post-betrayal life, I tried to imagine who I might be without those stories. I wrote lists, things I used to love, things I wanted to try, qualities I admired in others, and might one day claim for myself. Some mornings, I dressed with care. Not for Paul, not for the school moms at drop-off, but for myself. I began cooking meals I wanted to eat. I signed up for a community painting class. I sorted through old boxes, discarding things that reminded me only of loss, making space for something new, however undefined. It wasn't a smooth process. Shame would still sidle up beside me. Bitterness would flare and leave my words curt. There was no neat ending, no happily ever after reveal in my bathroom mirror. There was, however, a sense of emerging through narrow passageways of honesty, regret, acceptance, and hope. Each step was a risk. Each day an act of choosing myself anew, embracing the ongoing work. I would love to say I became endlessly brave, centered, serene. The truth is more complicated. What changed is this: I stopped running from my reflection. I welcomed its messiness. Some days, courage meant making time for joy, tea with a friend, a walk alone in the woods, reading poetry in bed. Other days, it meant forgiving myself for not feeling strong or loving or productive. Gradually, I set down the armors I'd worn for decades. I let myself be seen by my children, my friends, myself. My voice, hesitant at first, grew clearer. I claimed space in my own story, not as an extra or a prop or a cautionary tale, but as the main character, flawed, unfinished, but growing. If pain exposes what is fragile, self-confrontation builds what is resilient. The mirror is not a judge, but a companion. Through it, I came to understand that my dignity survived the breaking. I belonged to myself, finally, fiercely, and freely. And that is the moment I truly faced myself. Not by erasing my past or undoing my mistakes, but by standing in full light, whole even in brokenness, ready to choose, again and again, the messy wonder of being real. My new beginning. There's a peculiar stillness that comes after a world falls apart. A hush so deep, you hardly dare breathe for fear of disturbing what little remains. I lived in that quiet for some time. In the aftermath of betrayal, revenge, and bitter reckoning, it would have been easy, and sometimes tempting, to simply shrink inside it, to let the dust settle over the shards of my old life and call it survival. But something unexpected grew out of that silence, a flicker of stubborn hope, fragile at first, then insistent and bright. My new beginning didn't erupt all at once. It arrived quietly, in the shape of choices so small they could have gone unnoticed if I weren't looking for them. Choices that, when woven together, became the foundation of a life rebuilt not on illusions, but on something real and entirely my own. Letting the light in. For weeks, I forced myself from bed each morning, before the kids woke up, craving a moment's peace before the day's demands began. At first, I simply sat at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around my mug, staring out beneath the overhang of our porch at the street beyond. It took time to truly see that morning light creeping across the floor and realize it wasn't just another day to endure, but an invitation, however tentative, to begin again. I started opening the curtains wider, washing the windows Paul had never quite cared about, letting sunshine flood rooms that had grown stale and dim. Something as mundane as rearranging the living room, shifting the chair I always hid in, rehanging family photos, moving the ugly lamp to the garage, felt unexpectedly powerful. Small acts, but each one reasserted my right to shape my own space, to be the agent of transformation in my own home, redefining family. My children, in their own wobbly ways, sensed the shift. For too long, I had clung to the appearance of family, sitting all together, artificially cheerful, around a table heavy with unspoken pain. Now, I decided, the only tradition worth keeping was honesty. We began having truth nights, once a week over pizza. No judgment, just a chance to ask questions, name worries, or tell the silliest thing that happened that day. Some nights, Jordan would test the limits, admitting to skipped homework or teasing his sister. Abby once confessed to hiding my lipstick under her bed. More often, they just wanted reassurance that, yes, I was still here, and no, I wasn't going to disappear like the certainty that once filled our house. On quieter evenings, I read to them not just comforting stories, but tales of brave, imperfect heroes, real people who failed and fixed things and started over. In their questions, and sometimes their tears, I discovered reservoirs of strength neither of us knew we had. Little by little, our sense of family changed. We were messier, yes, but there was laughter again, tentative and then loud and wild. We created new traditions. Saturday pancake breakfasts, Sunday walks at the park, stitched together with whatever time, love, and clumsy honesty we could muster. Reclaiming myself. For so long, I had defined myself by the roles I served. Wife, mother, friend, dependable neighbor. As those collapsed, I was confronted with blank space I didn't know how to fill. The first time I went out alone, simply to browse the library, I felt exposed and aimless, unsure where to turn, without someone else's needs to shepherd. I began a slow process of rediscovering myself, returning to things I once loved. I dusted off an old collection of poems I'd abandoned in a drawer, surprising myself with how the words spoke to me as both the woman I was and the girl I had been. One rainy weekday afternoon, I sat down and began to write again. Not for anyone, not for a blog or the PTA newsletter, but just for the pleasure of arranging thoughts on paper. Writing wasn't magic, but it offered a lifeline, a place to lay down the chaotic tangle of regret, worry, and hope. Eventually, I shared a few pieces with Lindsay, my college friend, who encouraged me to sign up for an open mic night at a local cafe. The prospect terrified me, but the idea that I could be brave, if not polished, then at least vulnerable in public, felt like a victory all its own. What do you want, Emily? That question began to steer more of my days. Sometimes the answers were simple. I want to walk until my head clears, or call someone who makes me laugh, or bake a cake and not care if it sinks in the middle. Other days, the answers dug deeper, revealing ambitions and pleasures I'd left behind. Travel, painting, dancing in the kitchen, just because a good song was playing. Redrawing my social map. Many of my old friendships, or acquaintanceships, in Maplewood, faded in the storm's wake. At first, I saw this as a bitter loss. Gradually, I realized it was an open gate. The people who remained, like Lindsay, like my neighbor Mrs. Benton, who had quietly left flowers on my doorstep during the worst of it, were the ones who didn't require me to be anything but myself. I also made room for new relationships. I started volunteering at the local food pantry, not because I thought it would fix me, but because serving in a place without pretense showed me that brokenness and generosity often grew side by side. I met people with lives messier than mine, people who offered kindness with no expectation of gossip or repayment. At yoga class, among people who mostly ignored social hierarchy, I found unexpected kinship. There I learned to fail publicly, falling out of tree pose more than once, and that failure was not only survivable, but a source of shared laughter. That laughter, unforced and free, became an anchor against the old impulse to shrink myself out of sight. Crafting a home for the future. One day, I tackled the garage, an intimidating monument to family clutter and neglected promises. Sorting through old paint cans, I found forgotten treasures, child-sized soccer cleats, family photos from a decade earlier, half-finished craft projects. There was pain in letting go, but I learned to honor the memories without hauling every relic into my future. I painted Abby's room lavender, letting her choose the new bedding and posters. For Jordan, we built a bookshelf together, wonkier than I planned, but all ours. Upstairs, in the guest room that once belonged to Amanda on her girls' weekends, I made a bright, sun-flooded workspace for myself. No more reminders of borrowed happiness, just a place to become. Every project, every small investment, felt symbolic. I wasn't just patching holes or redecorating. I was reaffirming that we deserved beauty and comfort, not as a performance for outsiders, but as an offering for ourselves. Learning to trust again. Trust had once been my native language and my greatest mistake. In this new version of life, trust meant something else. I began by trusting my children with hard truths. Dad made mistakes, I made mistakes, but we still love you. When I faltered or failed, I said so, and showed them that apologies could repair cracks, at least a little. Trusting myself took longer. I had to learn to listen without dismissing my instincts. If something felt wrong, a comment at a party, a strange email, a new friendship for me, or the kids, I paid attention. In therapy, I practiced making decisions out loud without apologizing, reinforcing the idea that my voice mattered. Slowly, I opened a corner of my heart to possibility. I joined a book club, no longer strategizing to say only the right things, but daring to admit which books I hated or loved or hadn't finished at all. I let people see me, uncertain, hopeful, wholly human, embracing imperfection. The biggest difference in this new life was an absence of perfection. Perfect family, perfect meals, perfect smile, plastered on at school events. I was more patient with myself and others. I let mess linger occasionally, let takeout pizza happen on busy nights, allowed arguments to resolve without an anxious need for immediate harmony. The hardest piece, perhaps, was reframing my self-worth. I fought the old reflex to measure myself by productivity or sacrifice. Instead, I practiced gratitude. Some days for the sun on the kitchen floor, other days for nothing more than surviving with my kindness intact. I learned to forgive, though not always fully. Paul and Amanda receded from the tangled center of my life into smaller, manageable memories. Their shadows sometimes returned, but I didn't let them define the shape of my days. Dreaming forward. New beginnings take root, not in grand gestures, but in the steady accumulation of small, courageous acts. Saying yes to a new opportunity, saying no to a familiar mistake, accepting help, offering love without strings. I began to save for travel. Not a grand European tour, but weekends at the coast, trips into the mountains with the kids. Our first getaway wasn't seamless. We bickered about snacks, got lost on a hiking trail, laughed until we cried, throwing rocks into the river. For the first time, I saw my children, not as fragile survivors of a collapse, but as explorers beside me, brave and uncertain, and endlessly inventive. Late some nights, I'd lie in bed and ask myself, "Who are you now?" The answer, for once, didn't frighten me. I am still becoming, still learning, still flawed, but growing less afraid of the wounds I carry. My life is simpler, more honest, and far richer for everything I have risked and lost. The shape of hope. If I once built my world on compliance and illusion, now I build it on candor, grace, and the stubborn, looping thread of hope, the chance to begin again and again, as many times as it takes. I am not the wife I thought I'd be, nor the friend Amanda once relied on. But in the quiet of this new morning, with sunlight peeking across unfamiliar corners of our home and the laughter of my kids drifting down the hall, I know this: I am mine, and I am enough. Our story is still being written, not perfect, but real. And that, at last, is more than enough for a new beginning.